Hello, everyone. This is your first video in section 2 of Unit 1 on statistical experiments. I've divided statistical experiments, this section, into 3 different videos. So this first one is just on the basics, like as what is a study versus what is an experiment, the types of variables that you'll be dealing with, and then we'll get into some of the more complex stuff like principles of experimental design, blindness, blocking, inference, all that fun stuff in later videos, right? As always, what I would normally project to you is over on the left side of your screen, and your student notes are over on the right side of the screen. I am, like I said in previous videos, I'm doing this in Kami just because it's a little easier for me to type without changing formatting. But if you would like to work directly in the Google Doc, totally fine. All right, so let's jump into it. So the last section was all about observational studies. In observational studies, you literally observe people, right, or subjects, take in their data and measure certain variables, but you don't attempt to change or influence the responses of any of your subjects. That is not the case in an experiment. In an experiment, you as the statistician are deliberately trying to affect some change on your groups of subjects and to measure that response. Okay, so the definition of an observational study is that in an observational study, you observe individuals and measure variables of interest. Right, so typically that's like an opinion on something, um, or maybe you're measuring something specific about a particular subject. If it's an inanimate object, for example, if you're talking about time it took to make it, or length, or material, or it can be a many different things, right? So in an observational study, you observe and measure variables of interest, but you don't attempt to influence the responses. Okay? You are quite literally just observing what is happening. Okay? Most of the time, that happens with sample surveys. Okay? The goal of an observational study is to describe or compare groups. That's all you're doing. You're just trying to get data on a group to be able to compare two different groups, or to write a report on something, or to describe them. Okay, right? The key thing here, key thing, it's very important, is that you cannot judge cause and effect of one variable on another in an observational study. You cannot do that, right? Because you as the statistician are not actively changing one variable and measuring its effect on another variable. Okay? In an experiment, you deliberately impose some treatment on individuals to measure their response. Okay? This is the only way. It's the only way that you can get cause and effect data. It's the only way, right? Okay, so like I said, this section focuses on experiments, okay? And hopefully you'll see some similarities between processes that we use for observational studies and processes that we use for experiments, but they do have different terminology. They're not exactly the same, so you don't want to confuse them, okay? For example, you only use clusters when you're doing an observational study. We would use something called blocks in an experiment, but they do a similar type of thing, all right? So most of you all have taken a science class at some point, okay? So I'm sure that you've heard of, we call them explanatory and response variables in statistics, but you may have called them independent and dependent variables in your science classes, okay? So your explanatory variable explains or predicts changes in a response variable. So, i.e., that's your independent variable. I could spell. This is your independent variable. This is what you change as the scientist. Okay, basically, if you're thinking about like a scatter plot, it goes on the x-axis. Okay, independent, explanatory, it's what you change as the scientist. It's what you're using to measure the response variable. Okay, so your response variable measures the outcome of a study. Okay, so i.e., dependent variable. I'm really struggling with my spelling today. Okay, this is what you measure, right? It goes on the y-axis, right? There's a third type of variable that you may not have heard of before, which is called a confounding variable. Okay, so I'm going to kind of write out the definition and then I'll explain in more detail what it is. Okay, so confounding occurs when two variables are associated in such a way that their effects on a response variable cannot be distinguished from each other. Okay, so here's really what I mean by that. It's almost um, like what you do when you run an experiment where you have like a control group, right, to eliminate some of those confounding variables. So if you think about, for example, um, say you were growing plants in your um, like in your house, right? And you were testing like two different fertilizers or two different types of soil, for example, right? You took one plant though, and you put it in a room that's really, really warm all the time. And then you took the other plant and you put it in a room that was really, really cold all the time. Okay. If you measure the growth of the plant, you won't know for sure if the fertilizer was affecting the change, right? Or affecting how the plants grew, or if it was the temperature or some combination of both, right? So confounding is essentially an extra variable that could affect how the response variable actually responds to the treatment that you give to it, right? And it's not possible to separate the effects that were caused by the actual explanatory variable that you decided to change and the confounding variable that is just basically just kind of getting in your way. It's like muddying the waters, okay? So, AP tip for you. If you are asked to identify a confounding variable, you have to do two things. You have to explain how the variable you chose is associated with the explanatory variable. How does it muddy the water, right? Like, how is it connected to the explanatory variable? And two, how could it affect the response variable? So, in the plants example, right, temperature is a variable that could definitely affect how tall a plant gets or how many leaves it gets or how fast it grows, however you're measuring growth, right? Because some plants do really well in colder weather, right? Or colder environments versus some plants that do better in warmer environments, right? So you wouldn't be able to tell if the growth in the plant was due to the different temperatures that the plants were being kept at, or if it was due to the different types of fertilizer that you used. Okay. All right. So let's look at an example here. Whoop. Okay. So here's the question, right? Or the study. The study is these researchers were looking at screen brightness and battery life in laptops. Okay, so they got 30 new laptops of the same brand. They chose 15 at random and adjusted the screens to the brightest setting, and the other 15 were left at default setting. Okay, and then they measured how long the batteries lasted. Okay, so the first question is this an experiment or an observational study? Okay, I'm hoping that this is fairly obvious to you because we are in the section on experiments, but this is an experiment. Okay, it's an experiment because a treatment, which is the brightness of the screen, so that the treatment is what you decide to change, right? It's a general description of what you decide to change as the scientist, right? Okay, so it's an experiment because there was a treatment um, was imposed on the subjects. And the subjects in this case were laptops. Okay. Right. And then we have here, what are the explanatory and response variables? Okay. Okay, so the explanatory variables is what you changed as the scientist. So you changed the brightness level. Okay, and the response variable is what you measured as the scientist. So you measured battery life. Okay, and then a third little thing to note is that confounding was minimized by keeping lots of other aspects that could affect battery life the same for all subjects. Okay, meaning, right, and I'm going to highlight it up here in the actual question. So you have new laptops, right? So all of them were new, right? So it's not that the age of the laptop is affecting battery life, right? So I've like eliminated that as a confounding variable. They have same brand, okay? So it's not that the brand of computer is affecting the battery life. We eliminated that confounding variable. They're talking about randomness, which is good, okay? And then they have the brightest setting and then the default setting, right? So these were a couple of key things that they did to minimize confounding. All right. So there's one more question here, very similar. So I'm going to give y'all a sec. I'd like you to pause this and try it on your own, and then come back and see if you were right. Come back and check your answers. Okay. So give this one a try, and I'll see you in a second. All right, so let's take a look at this scenario here. Similar to the previous one, but there's one extra question at the end to kind of sum up what this video is about here. Okay, so here in this study, they wanted to know if eating dinner with families improves student academic performance. So an ABC News article said, teenagers who eat with their families at least 5 times a week are more likely to get better grades in school. And then the most important line on here is, this finding was based on a sample survey conducted by researchers at Columbia University. Okay, so as soon as you hear the word sample survey, the light bulb, siren, whatever you want to call it, that should go off in your head is ding, 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 ding. This is an observational study. Okay, so that's the answer to the first question. This is an observational study because students were not assigned to eat a particular number of meals with their family per week, right? They didn't select random teenagers and say, okay, this group of teenagers is only going to eat with their family once a week. This group is only going to eat with their family 3 times a week. This group 5, this group 7. That didn't happen, right? Because you can't do that in a sample survey. In a sample survey, they likely just sent out a poll to a lot of teens and families and asked, how many times a week do you eat dinner with your family? And then what are your general like grades and GPA? Okay. All right. So looking at number 2, your explanatory variable here. Again, you didn't change something. The scientist that conducted this study didn't actually actively change something, right? So this can get a little bit muddy, but the explanatory variable is just what varied between the subjects, right? So what varied was the number of meals per week eaten with their family. And then the response variable is what was measured, which in this case was GPA, or you could say grades. Right? I wrote GPA, but you could have written grades there. Okay. All right. And then the last question is probably the most important, and kind of sums up what this whole video is about, which is, can this study establish a cause and effect relationship? Okay. Because this is an observational study, the answer is no. Okay. No, you can't establish cause and effect from an observational study. Okay. The reason why is because in an observational study, there might be lots of other variables that influence the response variable other than the explanatory variable, the number of meals, okay? So there might be confounding variables here. And I gave you an example of one confounding variable, right? That students who don't eat with their families, like who don't eat many meals with their families over the course of a week, might do that because they have jobs that they have to go to, right? So students who have jobs might not be able to eat lots of meals with their families. And because of that job, they may also not have a whole lot of time to study, which leads to lower grades or a lower GPA. Okay. So because this is an observational study, it's unknown if the lower GPA was due to the lack of eating with their family, which is the explanatory variable, or the lack of time to study because of their job, which is a confounding variable. I'm over here really struggling hardcore with this writing. Sorry, y'all. The struggle is real when you're doing this with a mouse. Okay. All right. So that sums up what this video really is about. Okay. So in the next video, we're going to get into some more vocab and some more of the like nitty gritty stuff of experiments. So I will see you in the next video. Bye, y'all.